book in the Civil War about the honor guard.
Okay.
So today we have a distinguished visitor, Professor John Grabowski from that university up the street. I could spend the whole hour going over his resume, but I won't. I think John's most known for being connected to the Encyclopedia of History as an editor, managing editor. His official title also these days is the Senior Vice President for Research and Publications of the Western Reserve Historical Society. He's also been spending a lot of time in Turkey, I believe, at certain universities.
Back last year,
yeah. Turkey. I first got to know of him reading the history of the Polish Americans in Cleveland when I got involved over in Slavic Village. And going to talk to us today about his book on cultural gardens of Cleveland, the continuing saga. And, as I mentioned, if you haven't followed us, Plain Dealer's been running a series of articles about some of the cultural gardens. So if you haven't followed that and you're interested in any particular garden, I guess John's going to mention some that are coming along, relatively new. So without further ado, John Grabowski.
We'll keep this as informal as possible. One of the things I'll start this out. This is the book in miniature, okay, and it's but the story of the cultural gardens. One of the best people who began telling the story was Mark Thibault, the department at CSU, and Mark did an article on the cultural gardens that I leaned on to do this book. There were several other books that came out. There's been an interest in the gardens for a long time. So the question is, why did I decide to do the book? It wasn't me, it was Lauren Pacini. And Lauren is an old friend of mine. He's a photographer, does black and white shots of the city. And he's been in love with the cultural gardens for years. He's been taking black and white photos. So he wanted for the centenary. Now, this is a question about the centenary of the gardens. So it was going to be 2016 to do a book, and that never came out. And so we ended up getting together, and this book finally came out about 5 years later than that. But the book's not here. We'll show you a picture of it later. And knowing that there were several treatments of the gardens, I wanted to approach them a different way. And I wanted to look at not the gardens themselves, but the landscape that they're within. And I chose the Dome Brook landscape as the setting for the gardens. And the book talks about the gardens, but it does really get into each garden's history. That's been done online and everywhere else. So I contextualize them. So let's. Get pretty good advance on this.
On the side.
Is there a side? Oh, there it is. It was now on.
China. So we had to be. And then just.
Nope. That's okay. There it is.
Should be able to click it.
So we're going to computer.
Oh, please. So here, can you do it from here for him? All remote control. I think if you, this is.
Let's do it the old-fashioned way.
Okay. Right that way. Or we'll never use the roof. I'll make it worse by touching something.
Here we go.
And oh, she's working.
There we go. So we're fine now. So this is what the established cultural gardens look like, because they change every day, and you know that they're at Rockefeller Park, and they follow what used to be Liberty Boulevard, which is now MLK Boulevard, which we'll get into about an hour from now in this talk. And they are unique to Cleveland. I keep getting asked this question, are the gardens that special? There are monuments to multiple ethnic communities all over the United States. Milwaukee has a sort of garden. Pittsburgh has one at the University of Pittsburgh, but we're the only ones that have this one. So the question is, how did it come about? So let's see. As I mentioned, there are previous books on the gardens. This one came out in 1954, has been reprinted, and it really details the early history of the gardens, and it talks about the ones that were constructed at that time. And what's really kind of interesting, their paths are peace. The choice of that title is basically during the Cold War. And so you can find that the gardens are wrapped up in a whole series of contexts. One is the local context of when immigration came to Cleveland, when groups got power and they got identity. The other is the national context, i.e. American immigration policy, who could come, when they would come. The other is international events, putting people in motion, and wars. And the peace and war, that's very much a part of the gardens. The interesting thing is the gardens are not permitted. You're not permitted to put a military figure in the gardens. And there is one garden that has a stone that was taken from the Dolomites. It's the Italian garden that sort of commemorates it. So it's there. So there's a little bit of kerfuffle at times about that. And the other one with the gardens is contention and cooperation. The question you have here is that if, let's say, and I can say this because I'm half Polish, if the Polish community creates a garden, who do you choose to honor in the garden? What period of time is it? There used to be a Yugoslav garden. There is now a Serbian, Slovenian, and Croatian garden. So you can begin to see all these. And in the Yugoslav garden, I'm off script here, but I think it's interesting. The Yugoslav garden, the Slovenes ordered a bust from Ljubljana. This is in the 1930s. The bust never arrived. It was supposedly kidnapped. Now, who do you blame for kidnapping? So you've got all these stories here, but yet they're remarkable. As I said, it's the Domebrook landscape that I really want to park the gardens in, all the way from where Horseshoe Lake used to be. You want to get into contention there, all the way to the lake. It's that site that I think is very special. I think it defines the gardens.
John, could I ask you,
Sure.
going back to the previous screen, about who makes the decisions? Who is the governing body, the cultural gardens, that they can say there will be no military figures honored in these gardens? Who?
That started right from the beginning with Leo Weidenthal, Jenny Swick, and Charles Wolfram. That's what this was. It's interesting because the garden started in 1916 with the Shakespeare Garden, which is not really a cultural garden, but we'll get to that. And then in the 1920s, the three of them get together, Wolfram, Zwick, and Weidenthal, and they start the Civic Progress League in 1925. In 1926, it becomes the Cultural Garden Federation. And I'll get to that. Why do they do this? And the argument I would say, well, I'll answer it now, is that in 1916, the Shakespeare Garden is the tercentenary of Shakespeare's death. And they do a little English garden where poetry is read. There's a poet's corner and whatever else. And this is being celebrated by English-speaking countries all over the world. Yet, 1916 is World War I. And increasingly, the United States is looking against Germany and toward Great Britain. So you can be suspicious and say that the Shakespeare Garden was a visible structure saying that we are an English-speaking city, an English-speaking country. So this is the sort of stuff that revolves in there. You can't prove it, but you see it when you look at the gardens. You know, missing chat. computer has a mind of its own. There we go. Yeah. Well, there we go.
Ian said if you click
There we
outside, maybe the remote would work.
Okay.
So I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, this is working here. So what we're looking at here, this is from Roy Larrick. If you know Bluestone Heights, which is a sort of environmental group. Roy Larrick he's the expert on watersheds. So we're looking at old watersheds in the greater Cleveland area, Spring Valley. And the interesting thing about Dome Brook is that it's relatively unencumbered. Almost all of the other ones are covered up or culverted. And so Dome Brook has a fairly intact watershed that goes all the way to the lake. Shaw Brook is not there. Euclid Creek, yeah, that's there. Morgana Run and Burke Brook, you can't find them. They're underwater. They're underground right now. So this is the landscape. This is the plateau, and that's the valley. Try this one. There we go. So I actually start with the first keepers of the land. What did they do? What did they see Dome Brook as? Is there any evidence of Native American settlement in Dome Brook? And if you look at a map of Cleveland, and this was prepared for the encyclopedia, these are Native American trails and mounds in Cuyahoga County. And so right now we're looking at indigenous populations. These are mounds or remnants of mounds that were found here when the first settlers came. They were long gone by that time. These are sites where fortifications were. There was a school in Slavic Village. How many of you know Slavic Village? I grew up there. So it's called Mound School.
I grew up there too.
Yeah, and Mound School was built on the site of a mound. And so you have this, and then you have the trails, the Mahoning Trail, which actually takes you to the hydrographic divide, where Native Americans went over that divide to get to southern Ohio. It's where the canal follows, that Broadway Avenue now. So all this is here. So we were looking around, so can we find anything? These are artifacts were dug up near the Rockefeller Greenhouse. Yeah, it's following me. And the pot shards are rather old. I think they're 5,000 years old. The other ones are estimated at 3,000 years old. So we have that evidence. The first people who saw Dome Brook and evidenced Dome Brook are indigenous Americans. This is one of Lauren's photographs. You're probably wondering why it's here. This is the Opportunity Corridor. And the Opportunity Corridor at its very beginning follows part of that Mahoning, little branch of the Mahoning Trail. So if you knew Wood Hill Road and East 93rd Street, those were parts of that trail. Enough of that. When Moses Cleveland was coming to Cleveland, he encountered Red Jackets, a native spokesman, a really interesting figure. Many of the Native Americans that Moses Cleveland would have encountered already knew English because of all the British settlements. Some of them would have known French as well. And this is this is an incredible thing from the Historical Society. John Hawley was a surveyor with the Moses Cleveland Party, and he was at the meeting just south of what is now Buffalo, New York, where they were dealing with the Native Americans to clear the last impediments to get into the Western Reserve, even though the eastern half of the reserve was already open. And Hawley took down the speech of Red Jacket on a little pen. It's what you're looking at. You white people make a great parade of religion. You say you have a book of laws and rules, which was given to you by the Great Spirit, but is that true? And further on, it says, white people tell them they wish to come and live among us as brothers and learn them agriculture. So they bring on implements of husbandry and presents, tell them good stories, and all appears honest. But when they're gone, all appears as a dream. Our land is taken from us, and we still don't know how to farm it. And there's an inch where he points to his pocket. That's all the white men want. So that's what you have. 1796, Moses Cleveland's team comes out and they survey, and this is the first evidence we have. And if you know your Western Reserve history, you know that only the lands east of the Cuyahoga were available for settlement at that point. Native Americans still held the lands west of the Cuyahoga. And so this is why this stops at the Cuyahoga River. But what you're looking at, see if this, you're looking at here is probably Donebrook. But these are all those waterways. Nathaniel Doane, who was a member of the second party to come to Cleveland in 1797. Moses Cleveland didn't come back. I mean, my bad joke is Cleveland came here in the summer. He left in the early fall. He probably knew what winter was like. He went back to Canterbury, New Connecticut, and that was it. So this is an 1933 image, and this is Doane's Tavern, because Nathaniel Doane actually had land in Cleveland, and proper in Cleveland, I think which would have been superior at that point, because he had the recompense for his service to the company. And he came down with what many Clevelanders came down with at that time, the ague, which is malaria, because of swamps and mosquitoes. So he packed up and he moved 5 miles to the east, where Donebrook intersected what was known as the Buffalo Road, which we now know as Euclid Avenue. He started a tavern there, celebrated. And so he's the first person to really, if we're looking at non-native, to engage with the landscape. And when you look around that area now at University Circle, and people are drawn there by Donebrook, in part, we're looking at the Cozad Bates House here. How many of you are familiar with this? It's the oldest structure in University Circle. The middle section here was built before the Civil War. The back section a little bit later, and this sort of Italian Renaissance revival on the front. It's the Cozad family. Cozad, Bates, and Ford's families were all involved in the Underground Railroad. So I tend to see University Circle, not simply because I teach there, as a sort of special place. And in one of the Ford family papers, we read there's a very rare document. The 2 fugitives from oppression left this morning to make their freedom sure upon the soil of Canada. I wish in my soul every family north of Mason and Dixon's line might entertain for once a panting figure they never would aver again, either in theory or practice, that slavery was the home of contentment and righteousness. So it's a really rare document, but you have this, I think, special atmosphere in the section around the brook. And then further up the brook, North Union Shaker community, last Shaker community established in the United States. Ralph Russell, the founder of the son of Jacob Russell, brought a huge chunk of land in what is now Shaker Heights, converted to the Shaker religion, and he started a community that was named North Union. And so you have the Shakers on one end of Donebrook, you have the abolitionists on the other, toward the other end. So this is a picture of North Union after it was abandoned in 1889. The buildings would all be torn down. You know why the Shakers died, don't you? Died off.
They didn't believe in marriage.
That's right. Yeah. Celibacy. Yep. That's a heck of a way to perpetuate a religion. And at the time they were started, there was a religious fervor that drew people in, but that waned by the Gilded Age. And so this is part of that landscape. And they had 3 mills along the brook. One of this is a stone mill here, and this was dynamited for a 4th of July display in the late 19th century. They just blew it apart. So I talked to Lauren, who was doing the photography. I said, "Do you have a picture of where this was?" There it is. There's the foundation in the Donebrook Valley, just off of North Park. You're wondering where the cultural gardens are? Pretty soon. And there are some pictures of Lauren's photography of the Donebrook area. He specializes in black and white. That's the lower lake, which is still intact. This is another photo. This is a very informal presentation. So if you want to guess where this is, let me.
Salt mine?
It's a,
MLK.
yeah.
To put
It's,
water to.
yeah, that's the sewage relief tunnel that's being dug under the Donebrook landscape. It's completed now. And Lauren is a Vietnam vet, and he tends to go places where nobody else will go. So I thought I'd throw that in. Changing landscape of Cleveland. Let's get into where we want to be. The creation of what I call cultural signifiers. First cultural signifier in Cleveland for me is Public Square. This is lithograph done of an 1839 painting at the Historical Society of Public Square, and then it was the Cleveland Grays marching there. Public Square for me is, and I think it should be for all of us, a reminder of the New England origins. That the city was created around a square, which was part of the New England background. So it was structured, and the square has everything that you would need at this point. Church, houses at that point. Square now, of course, has a casino on the other side, which I don't think any of the New Englanders would have engaged with. First monument in Cleveland goes on that square. And it's Oliver Hazard Perry, the victor of the Battle of Lake Erie. And it's erected in 1860, first public monument in Cleveland. There are two shots of it here. So this is the later shot, and this one is 1865, and this is Abraham Lincoln's catafalque funeral. So public square becomes the area where things are remembered and monumentalized. That's a new term that I picked up. Trouble is that Cleveland is beginning to change. This is foreign-born. It's the percentage of foreign-born in the United States and foreign-born in the city of Cleveland over a number of years. So if you're looking at 1860, when the monument went up, look at nearly half the population was foreign birth. Largely English, some Manx, some Scots, lots of Irish, and a huge number of Germans.
Huge number of what?
Germans, yeah. That's good. And so in 1871, the German community decides to celebrate their victory in the victory of Prussia, the Franco-Prussian War, and the creation of the new German state or new German Empire. And they erect the triumphal arch on public square. They have a 6-hour parade going through. Now that's a temporary arch, but this is an ethnic community saying, this is who we are, and you can see us. The other way you could see ethnicity, if you want to see it in the city, church structures, synagogues. So you begin to do that. The Irish who were here from the time of the canal were also visible at St. Mary's and the Flats, and the earliest St. Patrick's Day parades were just about beginning at this time. So you see what I would call performance and construction of identity. Back at Donebrook. This is Wade Park Lagoon. It's 1888. And you see here, there's a centaur fountain in the middle, and there are two young ladies sitting here. Jephthah Homer Wade is one of the most remarkable figures in the city's history. He's one of the founders of Western Union. He was born in the Finger Lakes district of New York, did a number of jobs. He made bricks. He was a window sash fabricator. He was a portrait painter. Went off into Michigan to put in telegraph poles in the 1840s. I tell my students that he was an IT at that point. And he had the idea that all these independent telegraph companies should be brought together. And he was one of the creators of Western Union. Became immensely wealthy. Had his first house on Huron Road, his second house and that of his son Randall were on Euclid Avenue near East 40th Street. And he decided he wanted a rural retreat, so he bought land out around Donebrook. It was his private park, but he opened it to the public on weekends, and then he finally donated it to the city in the 1880s. So Wade Park becomes a special site along Donebrook at the southern, almost the southern end. So you've got a park there, and that's Jephthah with his grandson Jephthah and his great-grandson Jephthah. And in the 1880s, almost concurrent with that, and this is a little bit later, Western Reserve College is inveigled to come to Cleveland from Hudson, Ohio, and it sets up its site along with the Case School of Applied Sciences and on the old Cozad farm family. And Cozad. And so this is what it looks like. The circle is here. We won't get into a discussion why it's called University Circle unless you're interested. At the north end of Donebrook, William J. Gordon Park, made his money in groceries and iron. And he decided to buy the land where the mouth of the river, of the stream came out, and he created Gordon Park. And these are some images of Gordon Park before it was freewayized. And so there's the bathing beach, the bathhouse, and this is a structure just near the mouth of the river. So you have these two parks on one end of at the end of the stream, and one end towards the low end as it comes down from the escarpment, the Portage Escarpment. In between the parks and up the Portage Escarpment, these are shots from the 1890s that were taken by a city photographer of the land in between those two parks. Because in the 1880s, Cleveland began to build parks. And they began to think about, well, we ought to do something about that structure in between the two. So they began to buy parcels, but they photographed everything. And this is the railroad line at the north end, and that's Stone Brook. And that's another shot of Stone Brook, the cattle grazing there. And then they decided to cut the road up to Ambler Heights, which is on the escarpment. And this is the construction of the road. So this is all part of a parkway that's being planned. And then for the city's bicentennial, sorry, I'm way off, centennial in 1896, they get a letter from a part-time resident of the city, now full-time New Yorker, John D. Rockefeller. Now, Rockefeller lives in Forest Hill, and that's his house, which was going to be a sanitarium, but it didn't work out, so he took over the house. This was his Forest Hill estate. He would come here in the summer, go back to New York, where he was doing his business, and there he is, this young Rockefeller, when he had all his hair. He came down with alopecia. The man was totally bald. So any picture you see later, he is wearing a toupee. And the story about his toupee, I wonder, the story about his toupees, this is not in the book, is that he had them in different lengths. He could afford it, so he would change them so it looked like his hair was growing, and then he would go back to the short one. So for the birthday of the city, the centennial, there's a letter that comes in from John D. Rockefeller saying that he is going to purchase all the land between the two parks and recompense the city for such land as it's bought, and it's named Rockefeller Park. So you now have Rockefeller Park.
Is that house in Forest Hill still standing?
Oh, it's gone. It burned in the 1910s. And the big question is, was it arson or whatever else was? And there's a whole story I won't go into about Rockefeller, the fact that, he was under subpoena for, not paying taxes. He overstayed his time in Cuyahoga County. And basically the county auditor was like, ka-ching, we've got the man now. And they stayed in New York. And this is a long story. Invite me back and we'll do Rockefeller. But you're looking at up the hill, you've got a different thing. And I don't know how well you can read this. William P. Palmer, who was a steel mill magnate and also the president of the Western Reserve Historical Society, is living on the Overlook, one of the grand houses on the Overlook. And he is, these are letters to him, basically from the, this is to Tom Johnson from the chief of police, Fred Kohler, and this is from the chief of police to Palmer. Palmer was upset. He was upset because the Italians down the hill from him were setting off fireworks. It was the Feast of the Assumption. And so he complained to the mayor. The mayor punted it to his police chief. The police chief went out and said, well, there's nothing we could do. They're going over the city limits to set off the fireworks. I do this because you have a divide now between a largely ethnic city and the wealthy people who are moving up to the Heights. I live in the Heights, and the Heights' street names are basically English. So you can see. So this is the divide that's happening. But back down in the circle, 1902, it's the 50th anniversary of the visit of Louis Kossuth, the great Hungarian freedom fighter, the man who wanted to free Hungary from the grips of the Austrian Empire. So it created Austria-Hungary. And so he was a revolutionary mimicking the American Revolution, came to the United States to raise money, raised a lot of money, went back. So long story. But by 1902, there was a substantial Magyar-Hungarian population in Cleveland and around, and thousands of them came to the erection of the statue of Louis Kossuth. So you have your first real, quote, ethnic statue It's on Euclid Avenue, just to the south. It still stands there. It's been there for a long time. We're on Stearns Road. And so this is the ethnic community saying, we're here. Now, Kossuth is here. And the Poles get an idea in 1905 to erect a statue of Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was one of the Polish heroes of the American Revolution, helped build West Point, was a Polish freedom fighter. And the question I have, however quizzical, is why did they decide to do this in 1905? And I think it may have been in part because in 1901, a young man from the Polish community of Cleveland, he's of American birth but Polish background, assassinated William McKinley. He claimed to be an anarchist. And so I suspect that maybe we never know what the impulse really is. I suspect that it may have been to say that we Poles were also patriotic and we helped in the revolution. So that's there. 1907, the Germans in Cleveland create one of 4 replicas of a statue of Goethe and Schiller, with the originals in Weimar. There are 4 of these in the United States, and they erected in Wade Park. So you're beginning to see ethnicity rise within that circle area.
Did they have their separate plots?
No, it was just in Wade Park. Yeah, this was put in Wade Park, so there was no cultural garden at this time. So, but this statue will end up there. Creating Rockefeller Park. This is the real creation, a couple of images here. This is the 4 bridges by Charles Schweinfurth. The bridge, the railroad bridge, and the 3 street bridges, Superior, Wade Park, and St. Clair. Schweinfurth was the architect of Cleveland, so this is that one going up. And that's one of Lauren's pictures of it now. He's a brave guy because he's standing in the middle of MLK taking that picture. And this is how the park looks when it's finished. It's basically, it's not an avenue between a highway and Euclid Avenue. It is a promenade park. It's a place where you can take a horse and buggy or an early car. It is a park at that point. And the lagoon is the place to go ice skating in Cleveland. So the Rockefeller Park is an incredibly important place. That's the, now, if you're looking at this, you can see the Dome Brook there. And you can see it here now that it's culverted. We can get into a discussion of deculverting Dome Brook. World War I, we're almost there. Changes Rockefeller Park 2 major ways. Leo Weidenthal is to your left, and that is Shakespeare to your right. Leo Weidenthal, basically very Reformed Jew. He was a reporter. He was a theatrical. He loved theater. His collection of theatrical programs is part of the Cleveland Public Library. And he was born on the same date as Shakespeare, but not in the same year. So he had an affinity for Shakespeare. He's the man who suggests that we create a garden in Rockefeller Park to honor Shakespeare. And so that occurs in 1916. That's now the British Garden. Was the Shakespeare Garden, and then it's now the British Garden. So there is a bust of Shakespeare there. But what we're looking at is that there are 2 things that I would argue here. Is that this is being created, I've mentioned this a little bit before, I think to prove that English language is the language of the United States and of the city. It's the First World War is going on, so where are our sympathies moving by this time? And so the war maybe interacts with this. Group of wealthy Clevelanders put a film together. You should see it sometimes, called The Perils of Society. It's acted out by all the well-to-do people in Cleveland, and the proceeds from that film went to French orphan relief in the war. So you see that happening. Changes on the landscape. What was the lower drive through that area becomes Liberty Boulevard. And on Liberty Boulevard, there are about 1,100 Clevelanders died in World War I. And for each person, they planted an oak tree and a plaque with the person's name under it. It starts right near the lake and it goes all the way up to North Park Boulevard. Now, many of those plaques have been lost. Many of the oak trees have died, but they're now restoring the oak tree. So this is a monument to that. So we get into how does this become the cultural gardens? How does it get renamed after Dr. Martin Luther King? Interesting, because Ferdinand Foch, the general who won for the Allies, supposedly came to Cleveland. He was on a national tour of Cleveland in the United States in the 1920s. And this is not Cleveland. And we know that he got off the train in Bracknell, and his cortege, which was led by Troop A, came up what was Liberty Boulevard. And I'd like to wonder what he thought as his host explained what those little trees were and how the boulevard had been named. All of this is occurring while the United States is clamping down on immigration. The Literacy Act is finally passed over President Wilson's veto, and essentially that is to stop largely the immigration of Southern, Central, and Eastern Europeans to the United States, the assumption being that most of them couldn't read in their own language. And so this was passed over the veto during the war, but when immigration starts again around 1919, 1920, turns out that most immigrants could read. It was ineffective in staunching immigration. So we move on to the next thing, the 1920s. And this is a Klan rally in 1924, I believe, in Washington, D.C. 30,000 members of the KKK were there. So you have this anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-Catholic atmosphere floating around the nation. That's how you have to understand the creation of the cultural gardens when they were started. And the Johnson-Reed Quota Act is finally passed in 1924. There's an Emergency Quota Act in 1921, and it really cuts down the number of immigrants who can come in, and the percentages for Northern and Western European immigrants are much higher than those from Southern and Central European immigrants. And also in 1924, all Japanese immigration stopped. And in the 1880s, we banned Chinese immigration with the Chinese Exclusion Act. So you're seeing a racialized immigration law, and that's behind the park as far as I'm concerned.
If I'm not mistaken, our President Harding actually opposed those quotas,
Yep.
but Calvin Coolidge signed off.
Yeah, Calvin signed off, and he did a bargain. There was something he opposed. He said, but it's for the greater good. We'll do this. And it's a long, long story. So that's why Cleveland takes a different route. Cleveland is a very progressive city. In the middle of the 1920s, we have a city manager form of government. And Cleveland always had a progressive Democratic, Tom L. Johnson, and a rather progressive Republican Party at that point. And so Cleveland, in 1925, Zwick, Wolfram, and Weidenthal formed the Civic Progress League, and in 1926, they renamed that the Cultural Garden. And their plan is to allow various cultures to claim a spot of land. It's a complex process, and then to honor their own heroes, cultural heroes, if you will. The interwar garden. So this starts off, and it starts off the first garden in 1926, which is the Hebrew garden. You can see the list of how many of these are created. Now, I'll say this now, the ones in the 1930s, particularly after FDR is in, are WPA funded. The WPA puts over $500,000 into the cultural gardens. That's why some of the grandiose ones there are built with federal money. The question you have to ask yourself is, why is the WPA focusing on the gardens? And then you have to think about Franklin D. Roosevelt's coalition. He's trying to attract working people, trying to attract the immigrant vote. So you can play politics with this. I can't prove it, but you can play politics with this. But let's look at some of the gardens through. This is the groundbreaking for the Hebrew garden. And you're looking at Jenny Zwick, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, Chaim Bialik, a Hebrew poet. This is city manager William Hopkins, who really pushed the gardens, and this is Leo Weidenthal. So they're for the groundbreaking of the first garden, the Hebrew garden, which is now the Israeli garden, if you will. I think it may still be here. So that's the first one, and this is the way it looks now. This is And one of the things we see, we'll be honest about the gardens, these all had bronze plaques on them at one time, which were pilfered. And so they're now replaced with aluminum plaques. But
So is there any overall plan as to why the gardens went in particular locations or the groups that?
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure that there is. They did the ones on the upper boulevard almost first at that level, because you'll see a lot of them following up there. And it would take them a while to move over to the west side of MLK. But this is the first, and it has a wonderful fountain in it. And just to get into the gardens, what happens now is if a community wants a garden, they have to go to the Cultural Garden Federation and make a proposal for the garden. That proposal is looked over, and if it is approved, then it goes to the city, and the city will apportion a part of Rockefeller Park for them. And then it is up to that community to raise the money to build the monuments, to also take care of the gardens. Even though there is city lawn mowing that going on, taking care of the flowers, the plantings, everything else, pretty much within there. So it is civic input. And you get into the question of, who are on these committees? And I would say many of the committees, the earlier ones are the prominenti, if you will, of the ethnic communities. So if you looked at the committee for the Polish Garden, it's going to have Judge Eugene Sawicki. It's going to have business people. So that's what you're looking at that point. So that's that. And then 1929, the German Garden. It's 11 years after the horrible Hun, the pillager of Europe, had been defeated, and we're getting a German garden. And the Goethe Schiller Monument is moved there. And the Germans, wisely, they pick all of their great writers, and including one German Jewish writer, for busts around that. So it's basically a comeback from the German community. The Magyar Garden, the Hungarian garden, is built next after that, and that's interesting because there's Rose Ironworks did this little ironwork fence there, and you're looking at another community. The Hungarians were also at war with us, and the Hungarians lost a lot of land after the war. So how much irredentist policy was in this Hungarian garden? Was there any? And then, as I said, there's the Yugoslav garden. So this garden is started, as I mentioned, there's a problem between getting Serbs, Slovenians, and Croatians to really decide who's going to be on. And if you want to talk about Slovenians, I'm half Slovenian from my mother's side. The Slovenians were divided into the religious group and then the free thinkers, i.e. quasi-socialists. And in the 1930s, here all day, in the 1930s, the WPA was translating and abstracting ethnic language newspapers in Cleveland, and they had to choose one from each community. When they got to the Slovenian community, they chose two. One from the religious group, Meriška Domovina, and one from the lefty group called Inako Pravnost. They were not going to get in the middle of that battle. And this is the garden now. This is the Slovenian, it's Yugoslav, now Slovenian. This is the Czech garden. It's now the Czech garden, used to be the Czechoslovak garden. So, and this is one.
Did any of these groups ever ask their foreign governments to contribute to the?
Oh yeah, and the Greeks got money from the homeland, and the Italians got money from Mussolini's government. And the dedication of the Italian garden was attended by the Italian ambassador to the United States, which gets to all these things going on in this period. We go from the 20s to the 30s, and by the middle 30s, you have war in Asia, and it's percolating in Europe. So this is the background I find fascinating. The Greek garden, you can tell it's Doric. There's myrtle growing down the hillside. And this is one of the gardens I think that would not be alien to any quote American who went there, because we're steeped in Greek history. That's what the school is taught. These are the steps down. You can see the stonework. This is, some money from Greece, and a little bit of money from WPA, probably. The Irish garden. wondering what's Irish about this. You need a drone because it's a Celtic cross. And it's the only garden that was designed by a really major gardener. And that's A. Donald Gray, one of the great gardeners of Cleveland in the 1930s. He was the creme de la creme, so he designed this garden. It now has a fountain in the middle. And this is the Rusin Garden. This is a group of people who never had a country. They lived along the Carpathian Mountains. Their language is written in Cyrillic, but they are independent, and you get to this statue in the back, and that's what it says on it. I was, am, and always will be a Rusin. So this is a place where the community could say we exist. This is the Polish garden, Grabowski's, what he wants. And this is the latest statue in the Polish garden, and that is John Paul II, J2P2, as the kids used to call him. So the statues are still going in, but we'll get into a story. And then in the 1930s, there are two gardens. There's the National Garden. American Legion was here in 1936 for a convention, and they created a garden, the American Legion and Peace Garden. And then there's a National Peace Garden. And this garden now has reverted to a different name. It's Washington. This is a repop of a bust that was taken. And there's an American Peace Garden, and the American Peace Garden has soil from all 48 states. I guess they've got two that was mixed into the plantings there. And then the Global Peace Garden, I'm getting the name wrong, is the place where every new community, and this started in the 1940s, every new community into the gardens brings soil from their homeland. It is put into a crypt and mixed together. And for me, that is probably the most symbolic act that goes on at the gardens. This is the Slovak garden. This was a statue that was just down from Jephthah Lane, just below the art museum at one time. So that's the statue of aviator, missing his name, Stefanik. He was a Slovak nationalist World War I aviator, quite famous in Slovakia. And the Italian garden. It's the lower level. This garden stretches from the upper level down to MLK Boulevard. And that garden now, monthly in the summer, holds opera. And the latest statue is Michelangelo. So that's relatively new. The Italian community has just really begun to support this, so it takes a lot of community support.
How recent is that?
That statue is probably in the last 10 to 15 years. Yeah. And this is the Lithuanian, I'm blanking out. Yeah. It's Lithuanian garden. Across the street, this is one of the first gardens on the west side. This is the Ukrainian garden. That's a statue of a great Ukrainian poetess, Leza Ukraine. And that's in the middle. And it has busts that were done by a modernist sculptor from Ukraine named Archipenko. And they're just incredibly different now.
A stupid question. Has that governing body ever turned down a nationality group that wanted to put a statue in there?
I really don't know. In terms of what statue is going to be there. I think what they have to do before they get permission is to say exactly what they're going to do, but then they add statues over time. So once you've got the garden, you know, what goes in here. And this obviously, we'll get to, this has become a spot, almost a pilgrimage for many people now, given the situation, global situation. And war's end, changing city. 1946, the first, basically, All World Nations Day festival is there, and it's happened to One World Day Festival. It's called, and the first one is a major parade. This is after World War II. It's 46, the first year of full peace. Huge parade of different ethnic communities, starting from downtown Cleveland and going to the gardens. And that event happens every year now in August. And the only time it didn't happen was during the height of the COVID. So this is one in the 1950s, and that's Ben Stefanski, the founder of Third Federal, giving a speech there. And what you find there is you find all these acts. So these are contemporary photographs, which I threw in. You have step dancers, Irish step dancers. Estonian community walking in with their flags. Then the Cold War gardens. During the Cold War, the gardens become political theater because any politician who's worth their salt, Ralph Perk or somebody running for office and talking about the captive nations will go down to the gardens to honor the captive nations, those nations that have been usurped or taken in by the Soviet Union. And what better to illustrate the Cold War except the Nike site, which is right at the north end of Rockefeller Park, very close to it. What's happening at that time, though, is the neighborhoods around the gardens, all through Cleveland, are beginning to empty out to the suburbs. Two of my favorite pictures, the old lady who's wondering how the car got in the garage, and traffic on Lakeshore Boulevard. So you see suburbanization. And so the communities around the gardens, which were Slovenian, Serbian, Polish, beginning to melt away at that point. And they're being replaced in large part by the great migration of African Americans to Cleveland. You're looking at the numbers here, which are really astounding. And one thing I'll point out here is that between 1900 1920, you're looking at World War I when immigrant labor couldn't come to the mills. African Americans are fleeing prejudice, lynchings in the South. And so they become a necessary factor in the economy of Cleveland. And if you look again during World War II, it's the second Great Migration. So the question is, how is this community going to be represented in the gardens? Well, Carl Stokes, elected mayor in 1967. 1966 in Huff, 1968 in Glenville, you have choose your word, riot, rebellion, protest. These are two major communities on either side of the Delbrook Valley. And the gardens are affected by them. The gardens are tattooed with white power and black power graffiti. White people are afraid to go to the gardens. So the gardens begin to become somewhat quiescent at this point because of racial conflict. Moving fast here. 1965, LBJ signs the Immigration Act of 1965, which goes into effect in 1967, does away with quotas, gives overall, but it doesn't bar anybody. It gives a national quota. The first thing that will get you in is a job skill that no American has. The second thing that will get you in is you have relatives here. And immigration trends begin to shift from Europe very rapidly. By the 1970s, the bulk of immigration to the United States is coming from South America and Asia and the Middle East. So that affects it. So there's only the very slow growth of gardens at that time. Romanian was started by Ralph Locher, who was the mayor of Cleveland. He was born in Romania. That's the first garden after the rebellions, riots. African-American garden is finally given a site in 1977, and we'll get into that story prior to that, and the Chinese garden in 1985. Let's go through them. So this is UNESCO. This is the Romanian garden. This is Jan Sibelius, composer I would never want to meet in a dark alley at night. I mean, it looks fairly, and there are four major figures there. This is the Estonian garden. This is let me read this one to you. This is basically putting politics right out there. One day the age will dawn when all torches at both their ends burst into flame. Then the son of Kale will come home to bring happiness and build Estonia's life anew. That's what's going on. And finally, there's an African American, Booker T. Washington. But guess what? This is in the American Colonial Garden, because the Cultural Garden Federation couldn't decide whether African Americans were African or were they Americans. And so this bust is up. This has a very, very important thing. the statement from him is, I resolve that I would permit no man, no matter what his color might be, to narrow and degrade my soul by making me hate him. During the kerfuffle, problems with the garden, this statue was overturned 3 times. And the question, we don't know who. It could have been whites, it could have been Black nationalists who found that Booker T had been too much of a conservative. You don't know, you can't describe, but that's what's going on. And bronze statues were being lost, melted down. Many statues were taken off and put into storage for fear. The gardens were really at death's door. And as Cleveland became poorer, the amount of money put into Rockefeller Park became so minor that there's one statement that the Rockefeller family was going to ask them to rename the park. Finally, this is the African American Garden. This is the first stage. It starts on Wheelock Avenue, and it's going to come down. There are 2 more stages to be built. So this is the gateway out of Africa into slavery. There are 2 more sections that go down the hillside. Wild for that. And the Chinese garden is not in the cultural gardens. It is right across the street from the Cleveland Museum of Art. Now, one statement is, well, maybe people didn't want to go into the gardens. The other statement is that the Chinese had, well, let me say the Taiwanese, because this was started by a Taiwanese businessman, wanted a larger space to do what they wanted to do. And so this garden now is both Chinese and Taiwanese. It's the only cultural garden that does not fly a flag. Outside of the Russian garden now, they've taken their flag down because of what's going on. So it's international. And yeah. These are the gardens that have almost, it's not all of them. This is the rebirth. And you can thank, my argument is you can thank the Asian Indian community for putting their money up and putting a major statue on the boulevard. So you can see them coming up, and I'm sure I've missed some. And there's the statue of Gandhi, who on his plinth is 17 feet tall. It's a fabulous garden, and the thing that's really remarkable is because the street was renamed after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And that caused an argument, of course, because it had been Liberty Boulevard. But as someone said recently, there's no place in the world that you'll find a statue of Mahatma Gandhi on a street named Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. I don't know. And this is your Latvian garden. And the Ethiopian garden is one of the more recent ones. This is my favorite thing. I like this. A monument for the ages celebrating multi-ethnic and multi-religious diversity. Ethiopia, the origin of mankind, the Nile River, and coffee. So it's what the community wants to be seen as. And this is what it looks like. It's a mosaic. It's a wonderfully beautiful mosaic, number of colors. It's one of the times I wish Lauren was shooting in color. And we have a Russian garden. Now, there is no way we would ever have had a Soviet garden. And this is Yuri Gagarin. This is the first person here. And the statement here is, orbiting Earth in a spaceship, I saw how beautiful our planet is. People, let us preserve and increase this beauty, not destroy it. Like Gagarin. And finally, there's a Syrian garden. Now, the Syrians had gotten this space in the 1920s, I believe, and they couldn't develop. They finally have. So there's and this is really more developed than ever before. It's a fantastic garden. This is the Armenian garden. The Armenian alphabet was designed by noted architect Bur Shakarian. And his son, Pietro Shakarian, is the man who wrote the article on the cultural gardens for the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History. And so this is the Armenian garden. And it is cheek by jowl with the Azerbaijani garden. Right across the street. You know, Azerbaijan, yeah, you know what's going on there, right? And so, and this is largely a gift from former president of Azerbaijan because he got treatment at the Cleveland Clinic. Okay, we've had a lot of time in Turkey. This is the Turkish garden. It's 2 stones. It says Hoş geldiniz and welcome. That's the same thing. And their plan is to put a statue up of a Turkish woman voting. And this gets into the politics of Turkey, because a lot of the leaders in this are basically Kemalists. These are people who are more secular, they're Turks. And the pushback is, of course, with the more religious people who are Erdoganists. There's been a kerfuffle between them. But what they want to do is they want this picture of a Turkish woman voting in the 1930s. And but that is right above the Armenian Garden. Not planned that way, it just happens. And the Albanian garden is Mother Teresa. We're almost there. And the new Serbian garden, which is largely basically Alex Machaski, former editor of the PD, has really put a lot of money into the Serbian garden. This just has a lot of small statuary. This is very close to the freeway. And finally, there's the that works. It's the new Croatian garden, and it starts up on the top of the hill, Upper Drive, East Boulevard, and it spills down to the hill. And from my opinion, this is me talking about what my likes and dislikes are. It has the best statue in the garden. The anonymous immigrant mother and children. Doesn't say she's Croatian, doesn't say who she is. She didn't invent anything. She didn't write anything. She just came over with her kids and started a new life in America. And I think this is a major break for the cultural gardens, when people feel free to move away from saying, this is who we are, to the broader image of immigration, migration, difference. And that's a favorite. And this is the book. And I'm going to read you one section from the book. It comes from close the book with this. Yet what holds the gardens together, what allows them to be seen as a unit, what also awakens the visitor to the issues that have divided nations and people, is the Domebrook Valley. Certainly it is now a human-made landscape, and the stream, often bordered by stone walls, is no longer free to carve its own path. But both the stream and the valley make for a narrow, long, linear setting of natural cultural juxtapositions that is astounding and deeply provocative. While almost all the small post-glacial streams in northeastern Ohio have been largely hidden in culverts and forgotten, this piece of the region's natural history has survived, and in doing so has become a home for stories all much younger than itself, the multitude of human cultures that have come to make up the city and the nation. Absent the brook and the valley, the story in all its complexity will not be told as well as it has, and will continue to be in the future of Cleveland Cultural Gardens. I think it's the brook that holds the gardens. That's it.
Is there any program that brings school children to the gardens to learn about